Okay, I'm back with another video for BookTube. Finally doing the third book in Robert Jackson Bennett's Divine Cities trilogy. It's been a long break in between doing the second and third book, even though I read the third book immediately after finishing the second book. I have to admit I was holding out hope for more people to watch the videos and hopefully get a discussion going so that I can include other people's reactions in my last video. But alas, I am disappointed. I guess I should have done more to publicize it or something. Like, gone onto some fan pages and shared the link or something. I didn't think about that. I'm not a very good self-promoter. What can I say? Anyway, between waiting for that and traveling for the holidays and one thing and another, I just didn't get around to this until today. So, better late than never, I guess. And maybe this time I'll be able to get the link out there. So, as with my previous videos, I'm going to be discussing the plot, although not in quite as minute detail as I would have if I had done this video sooner, because frankly, I've forgotten a lot of stuff, and I had to go through the book again to refresh my memory. And then I'm going to do the same thing as before, where you can just kind of listen for an overall review, and then turn off the video if you don't want spoilers, and then I'll get into the heavy-duty spoiler stuff after I've given you that warning. So, first of all, this was a really good conclusion to the trilogy. I think he didn't leave any major stones unturned, but he did leave a few questions, kind of permeating in the mind of the reader after the series ended, which I think is really a nice thing to do. You don't want to answer every single question, but at the same time, you want to answer the major questions, and you don't want to leave your reader completely confused and flummoxed, wondering about so many different things. So it's a really fine line to dance on, and I respect the hell out of any writer who can find a good way to find a great balance, because it's not easy to do. And so many writers for both books and TV and movie series really fall short of that and kind of, overestimate what they should explain or underestimate what they should explain and leave too many holes. And, it's not easy. So angry fans are quite common, obviously, when they get it wrong, but I think we should be more forgiving when they do. And I say that even though I myself have been on the message board. It's like, how dare you? This was a terrible ending. So kind of a hypocrite for that. But anyway, I think he did a great job. And the little picky things that I had a problem with in no way changed my opinion that this was a really solid trilogy. Great characters, fantastic and fascinating story. And some really cool themes and some really challenging themes, as I expanded upon in my second video, themes that even made me rethink my own perspectives and challenged my assumptions and my beliefs, which I really appreciate. It takes a really good writer to be able to do that and force a reader to be introspective and question what they think and what they believe without at the same time alienating your reader by telling them straight out that they're wrong. So I admire that, as a writer, that's something that I would definitely aspire to do with my own work. So I really respect the fact that he can do it in what seems to be, an effortless way. So basically, in this book, Sigurd is back. It's not really a spoiler to tell you that he's investigating the death of his former boss, Shara, because you find that out in the first couple pages, and you find it out if you read the back of the book. So no spoiler alert there. So once again, it's a murder mystery. Second verse, same as the first. It's really the third verse, same as the first, because That's exactly what he and Shara were doing together in the first book. So it's really sad to see Shara go, even though we really only had the first book to get to know her. She wasn't really in the second book that much, and she's not really in the third book. I can't explain that more without spoilers, so I'm not going to discuss it now. I'll discuss it after the spoiler mark. So anyway, we don't really get to know her all that well, and yet her loss is something that reverberates throughout the book, and I felt it. So that's also a sign of just strong writing, strong character building, that he would be able to make us feel something for this character with so little quote-unquote screen time. So anyway, while he is hunting for her killer, he comes across an even worse killer whose name cannot be named, very mysteriously, although I will name it after the spoiler. And I thought that the mystery was really cool. It went in some unexpected directions. It was an excellent mix of new characters and old characters popping up for cameos and helping the plot along. They weren't just there to be like, hi, remember me? I'm so-and-so that you liked from the last book. They actually served a function. So I think he really does well with that. You know, he doesn't have any superfluous scenes or superfluous characters. Everything he puts in his books really has a need to be there as a piece of the puzzle. So as any good mystery writer knows, you can't just introduce people and kind of let them go. So I really appreciate that. Even the character who I thought had been completely dropped from the second book pops back up and plays a huge part in the third book. And it seems very natural and very organic. So I love the way he handled that. I also really respect his willingness to kill off characters. Obviously, I won't say who he kills off at this point, but, well, except for Shara, obviously. But, you know, nobody is safe, kind of a thing, so I really like that. There were a few predictable things in this book, but I don't really fault him for that. I'm just a frequent reader, and when you read enough books and you watch enough movies, you can pretty much figure out most plots. You know, there aren't that many plots, frankly. He does a fantastic description of action scenes. Like, this is something that I'm kind of ambivalent about in most books and even in movies. Like, when I watch a movie for the second time, I use the action scenes as like my cue to get up and use the bathroom or grab a snack or whatever, or check my phone. Like, I don't care to rewatch action scenes. I think, you know, once you've seen it once, you're like, okay, well, that's what happens, and then in the end, the good guy usually comes out of it perfectly fine, so who cares? We know that he's going to survive all this craziness, so why should I bother really getting invested in this action? You know, it might be fun to watch, and I'm sure it was very expensive to shoot, but it doesn't really have any consequence on the plot 9 times out of 10. So I would not say the same for his action sequences in this story. I would say that all of them have various consequences, either on Sigrid himself or on the plot, and they seem to really matter, and they're well written, and they're very cinematically written. So I was entertained, actually, and I think in rereading this trilogy one day, which I'm sure I will do, I always like to go back and reread things, I'm not going to just kind of skim past the action sequences, because some of the action sequences I went back and reread even as I was reading the book. I was like, whoa, that was really cool. I don't think I can quite 100% visualize it, so let me go read it again. Or, oh, that was super cool. Let me read again like the exact detail that happened there, because this detail that I didn't think was important did turn out to be important. I want to go verify exactly what happened there. So he does a really good job of that. It's like hiding little plot keys. Like, I don't want to call them plot keys to plot holes, but what am I trying to say? Like little plot nuggets, let us say, little gold nuggets of plot detail are hidden in some of these action sequences, which also makes them good to go back and revisit. So overall, really good book. Loved it. Loved the trilogy. Great wrap up. Eager to see what he does with Foundry Side. That's another reason it took me so long to get back to this video, because I went back and read the first Foundry Side book again. like I said, I love to reread, but it's because the second Foundryside book was supposed to be released in January, and instead they pushed it back to April, which is totally a bummer. But whatever, I didn't reread it for nothing. I enjoyed reading it. But it also kind of highlighted the similarities that I noticed in the first book, and between the first book and Foundryside. They can also be found between the third book and Foundryside, because as I mentioned before, the third book and the first book are very similar. So City of Miracles and City of Stairs have a lot in common. They both have their final big action showdown in the city of Bulakov, which is the City of Stairs. And they have similar plot devices. So before I say anything more about that, let me go ahead and say from this point on, spoiler alert. And if you don't want to know anything about the details of the plot, you can stop listening now, but I hope you'll come back once you finish the book. So basically, in City of Miracles, we find out that Ashara's work all this time, since even before she became Prime Minister, and certainly to an even greater degree after she left the office of Prime Minister, because remember, if you read the second book, or if you watched my other video, she was not going to be Prime Minister for very long, because she was very unpopular, because she wanted to help the colonials who had formerly oppressed her people, and her people were not down to just forgive them and give them money. And frankly, I hear them, that makes sense to me. So if I had been living as a character in that world at that time, I frankly don't think I would have supported her either, because these people were slave owners. They enslaved my ancestors, not even really my ancestors, literally my parents. Why would I turn around and be like, yes, of course, you can have our money and have a comfortable life? I'd be like, no, F you. So she had a tough time making it as Prime Minister, and then when she left office, she used her considerable wealth and resources to track down orphan children. And it turned out that the orphans she was tracking down were the children of the gods. Now, in the first book, we ran into one of these little divine creatures who was a child of the gods, and it was very badly described, in my opinion. It didn't really make an impact on me plot-wise. It was just some monster of the week / chapter type of deal, where they defeat it easily and then get past it, and then it doesn't matter anymore, so it's not really that relevant to the plot. Now it turns out that Zhukov, the trickster god, and Olivos, the god who vanished way, way before the other gods got killed by Shara's ancestor, the Kaj, had a bunch of other kids, and that these kids' memories were wiped, and they were hidden even from themselves in order to keep them safe, because the gods who were being assassinated one by the Kaj didn't want the same thing to happen to their children. So their children were basically human in form, not like the weird monster they encountered in the first book that was surrounded by a ring of salt or whatever. So they can move around like normal people do. And then as they get older and their godlike powers start to manifest, the spell that was put on them activates, their memory gets wiped again, and they wind up being put with another foster family in a different place, so that no one will realize that they are not actually growing up. So they keep going from foster family to foster family. And then a few of them manage to break free of this cycle and actually stay in a state, like a mental state, where they know that they have divine power. And they manage to successfully hide from the rest of the human race. But they are not able to hide from Olivos and Zhukov's worst child, who is called Mukov, which I thought would mean night in some Slavic-y language, but I couldn't figure it out from Google Translate, which doesn't mean that it doesn't. Just Google Translate's not that great for most languages. But anyway, it does kind of mean night because he is the god of night. And he has the ability to meld with the shadows and turn the shadows into his own private, separate dimension. He can yank people into the shadows, and they'll be lost there forever, kind of a thing, until they go crazy. And then he puts them back in the real world, and now they're crazy, but they've only been gone for like a second in the real world. So that's how he like tortures people and gets whatever information he needs from them. He also uses that method to steal money, because people tend to keep money in dark places like safes. So he can reach into those through his little shadow dimension and just take their shit. And then he uses it to pay henchmen. So he has all these human henchmen working for him, including one who becomes pretty important in the story as the dragon. This is the figure that TV Tropes calls the big bad's primary henchman, the one who's like his top level enforcer, the one with all the physical power most of the time. So that is who this person becomes. So when the story opens, we surprisingly get a glimpse of Shara's assassination through the eyes of the man who was hired to kill her. And he just so happens to be a man. I don't know how exactly to pronounce his name, but it looks like it's pronounced Cadiz or Kadsi. So we get to see it through his eyes, and he happens to really hate her for personal reasons, because he was corrupt, and she found out about it, and she got him expelled from his position. So he typically blames her for the loss of his career rather than blaming himself. So he's only too happy to end her life really violently, which he then does. So that's pretty tough, as I mentioned, pretty tough to watch. But as it turns out, she's not really dead altogether. And that's because she had one of her little adopted godlings with her. And this little girl is in charge of the past. Like, she has the ability to see the past and to temporarily recreate the past. And she winds up pulling part of Shara's essence into some kind of a weird time loop, so that Shara continues to exist in that moment in the past, just before her death. And she is able to remove Shara from that little pocket loop and put her back into the real world later on in the book. And Shara is able to communicate with Sigrid in this fashion. So that's what I meant earlier when I said, okay, well, semi-spoiler, like, she's not really dead. I mean, she is, but magic. So anyway, this is one of the girls that Shara adopted. Not really adopted, but was just like taken care of. The girl she officially adopted is one that she named Tatiana Komaed, and she is the little girl we caught a glimpse of during the communication spell that was used to talk to her in the second book. And if you watched my other video, you know I had a little theory that she was going to turn out to be Shara's biological daughter, fathered by her ex-boyfriend from Vurtistan. Well, I was wrong. Sorry, not Vurtistan, that was the second book city, Bulakov. So anyway, yeah, I was not correct about that. It turns out she legit was adopted. And she was also one of the little godchildren. So you can start to put the pieces together on your own, because even though Bennett tries to be subtle about it, it becomes clear once we do finally meet Tatiana through Sigrid that she has the ability to tell what's going to happen in the future. It's not as developed as the other little girl's ability, because she's been living like a human and hasn't really had the opportunity to use her godly powers, but they do still give her kind of a clairvoyance or a prescience that Sigrid is able to use to his advantage to avoid some traps that were set for them. So it becomes quite clear, oh, okay, so this little girl and the other little girl are obviously connected. And then, well, actually, it's clear way before that, because they look alike. So Sigrid thinks that they must be twins who were separated at birth. In fact, they're the same person. And the gods, way before they were killed, took the child, who was the daughter of Orvos and Zhukov, and split the child into two. So instead of being Simpros, the past, she became two girls. Alvos, future, and Tulvos, the past. And Tulvos eventually forgot who she was because of the spell that was put on all the godly children that I mentioned earlier, and she started calling herself something else. And this other little girl became known as Tatiana. Malwina, that's the other girl's name. So Malwina helps Sigrid as he hunts down this killer, Kadsi. And when Sigrid catches up with Kadsi, it's a really cool scene where he gets not only Kadsi, but all of his men in the middle of a meeting with Nokov, who again, Sigrid doesn't know who this guy is. He's just an obviously powerful demigod. And they don't really know exactly what his agenda is, except that he's killing children. And this little girl helps him escape from Nokov, although it's clear that Nokov is looking for her too. So it quickly becomes clear that Nokov's agenda is to hunt down and kill all of these different divine children. And every time he kills one, he absorbs that child's divine power and becomes increasingly stronger with each child that he kills. So the children are hiding from him in a little pocket dimension that was created by one of them. And they're put to sleep so that their godlike powers won't register, because it only registers when they're conscious and aware. And the keeper of this little pocket dimension is a female goddess who is in love with Malwina. And Malwina is the LGBTQ character representation that we get in this book. Although unfortunately, just like in the first book, where we had the gay or bisexual ex-boyfriend of Shara representing the LGBTQ demographic, the characters die. Malwina herself winds up being fused back into Tatiana and eventually just kind of ceases to exist because they refer to the resulting character as Tatiana. So it's as if Malwina never was. And then her girlfriend dies trying to keep Nokov, unsuccessfully as it turns out, from killing the other godly children. So that just kind of sucks. I know that it's a common complaint in fiction, and especially in sci-fi, it seems, that whenever you do have a non-straight character, something bad tends to happen. They don't get their happily ever after. So I would say in this case that Bennett's not really inclined to give anyone a happily ever after, so it's not personal, but it is, kind of an unfortunate trend that he does nothing to go against. So while Sigrid is trying to protect Shara's daughter, he has to fight off Nokov and try to find a way to destroy this guy. So he comes across Mulagash, who helps him, but her help is limited because, again, she doesn't really like or trust Sigrid all that much anymore because of all the people Sigrid killed in the second book as revenge for his daughter's death. So he still feels shitty about that. And Mulagash herself is caught up trying to keep her homeland together because obviously Shara's death caused a big reaction, and Mulagash has now become, or by the end of the book, she has become the prime minister in Shara's place, although not really in her place because Shara hadn't been prime minister for a long time. And then people keep commenting on how Sigrid hasn't aged much, like how he still looks exactly the same and seems to be the same age as when they last saw him, even though, 20 plus years have passed in between books 2 and 3. There's a huge time jump. So it's noticeable. Like Mulagash herself has white hair and she's super frail compared to how strong she used to be. But here Sigrid is same old, so people notice it. Another person who notices it is Shara's ex-boyfriend's fiance, Ivania Restroika. And this is a character who popped up in book 1 that I mentioned just vanished partway through book 1 and was never heard from again. So she comes up again, but it doesn't seem very abrupt. It seems like a good reintroduction to her. It turns out that she and Shara became friends. she's still really rich because she now has not only the money and social position that she had before, but when her fiance died, and he was a very prominent, very wealthy member of Bulakov society, she inherited all of his money and everything too, his house, everything. Even though they never did officially get married, he had no other family. He never had any children of his own. So much for my theory. And his brother died hysterically in the first book, and he himself died heroically. So there was nobody else, and she just got everything. So she's super, super duper witch, and she is taking care of Tatiana in Shara's place because Shara really wanted her protected, and Ivania definitely has the money to do so, but she's also just a badass in her own right. She has tons of weapons. She knows how to use them. So once again, we get a really cool, leveled up female character who's not a stereotypical badass. Like, she still does feminine things as well. So I think Robert Jackson Bennett does a really great job of writing characters like this who aren't just a stereotypical short-haired bad guy. I mean, badass woman, but are pretty much well-rounded female characters who also happen to be badasses. So when Sigrid catches up with her, we get some nice scenes where he bonds with Tatiana, teaches her how to shoot. Tatiana is really keen to avenge her mother's death and all, and we get to know her powers and everything. And then he goes off on a little vision quest type of thing that also happened with Mulagesh and his daughter in the second book. I didn't mention it in that video because it was already quite long, and it wasn't that important to the overall plot. They go a place, they get a thing, they learn a thing, they go back, like whatever. But in this case, what he learns is the origin of Nokov. So it's once again this plot thing where the oppressors, the people who were oppressed turn around and do the same thing that their former oppressors did to them. So all of Shara's people and the military are guilty of taking this child, who happened to be a divine child, locking him up in a heavily armed ship and running experiments on him and like trying to figure out how they could weaponize his power. So he was driven crazy after being kept locked up for years. And of course, he hates Shara's aunt, who was the one responsible for running that program. She's responsible for all the bad things. And he hates Shara by extension, which is why he wanted Shara killed. And also because Shara was trying to hide these divine children from him. So Sigrid goes to find this wrecked ship where they had been keeping this guy like off the grid, away from their actual homeland, and one day he managed to escape because he got strong enough to get out. And he killed everybody quite horribly, it's implied. And then they just kind of left the ship there and washed their hands of the project. Now, this part to me didn't really ring true, because Sigrid manages to find this ship just like washed up on an island somewhere, and he does have to sail for like a week to get there, and I don't really remember how he finds it. Somebody guides him to it. But to me, it didn't ring true that he would be able to find this ship relatively easily, and nobody else had ever found it for like 10 or 20 years or whatever. I mean, I feel like someone would have come across it and publicized that information, but whatever, I'm willing to take that with a grain of salt. So Sigrid goes, he finds out what he needs to find out. It's a pretty cool descriptive scene, the way he has to like climb up on this ruined boat that's been beached on the sand. And then he goes back, and then the best scene of all, in my opinion, in the whole book follows, where he, Tatiana, and Ivania have to get from this little farm, well, not little, it's a huge estate actually, where she's been hiding out, back to Bulikov, to her mansion there. And at first they're going to take the train. They talk about taking something called the Aero Train, which is a new invention, and it's not really something that all the characters trust. Like, at least one or two of the characters are like, no, we don't know if that's safe. Plus, it's super expensive. Plus, you have to book your tickets way in advance. And Tatiana is the main one who like really wants to try it. So I think the Aero Train might actually even be one of Sigrid's daughter's inventions. Like, the girl had all these drawings and plans before she died and wasn't able to implement any of them. But I think maybe that's also part of the reason why they didn't want to do it. Like maybe it reminds him too much of his daughter or something. So anyway, they decide to go by regular train through the mountains instead of arrow train over the mountains. And as it turns out, the arrow train is kind of like a huge cable car where these little pods can just kind of go along like you would ride a cable, on a cable car in the mountains, except obviously it's much longer of a trip. It actually sounds pretty freaking cool. So this, the dragon, the one who's hunting them down in the name of killing them for Nokov, tries to follow them on the train, but Tatiana uses her future prediction powers to know that someone's coming after them. So at the last minute, they bribe somebody on the arrow train and wind up taking that instead. And the woman who's following them has to, round up all her bad guys and go after them by using their military identification to take another car and go on the train right behind theirs, like the little pod or whatever, right behind theirs. And Sigrid has to, in the middle of a blinding snowstorm, climb on a cable from their pod to the pod with all the bad guys to prevent them from throwing a bomb onto their pod. I mean, it's such a cool scene. I would love to see that scene in a movie. It's just so awesome to read. That's the one I went back and was like, let me read this again. And again, I do not really jazz on action scenes like that. So for me to say that is high praise indeed. So I loved it. That scene was so freaking cool. And it's just so well described and so logical, the way he does it. And there are so many moments where it's like, oh, he's not going to make it. He doesn't, Robert Jackson Bennett doesn't try to make it look or sound really easy. It's hard work, obviously, and a lot of it depends on luck, and it doesn't all go according to plan. A few things go really wrong, and he has to compensate, and it's just really cool. I love the way he wrote that scene, that whole sequence. And then during the sequence, things get so shitty for the bad guys that the main bad guy, whose name I'm fucking flipping through trying to find because I forgot to write it down, is this woman, and she was given something by Nokov in order to, here's her name, Mishra, yeah. So Mishra is actually Sepuri, and she, for some reason, I don't remember, I think it's because her brother was killed or something, she is willing to work against her own government to help Nokov instead of being loyal. So Nokov gives her something to use in case of an emergency, and it's something that she has to put inside her body or eat or whatever she does with it, and it turns her into a living avatar of Nokov, just this all-powerful, the character then becomes called the Seneschal. So she represents silence. And the way that Bennett writes this bad guy is just so spooky and creepy. The way he describes what she turns into. Because she obviously doesn't look like a normal human anymore. And every time she comes around, all the sound is just sucked out of everything. And it's just so cool. I love it. And she doesn't die easy. Sigrid has to really go up against her. Or it, whatever it is now. And then there's another big showdown with that creature at the end of the story, too. So that was all very well done, very cool, very well set up. Loved it. So they get on this train. They make it by hook and by crook. And they have to stop Nokov from climbing a giant staircase that he makes with his new godly powers. And the little girl realizes, or the two little girls, I should say, realize they're one little girl, and they get back together. And then, the ending isn't as convoluted as some of his others have been. In fact, most of his others, and including American Elsewhere, but I won't spoil that one. Instead, it's pretty straightforward. They have to fight the Seneschal, and then they have to find a way to stop Nokov. And it's a little bit anticlimactic because once the girls realize that they're really the living embodiment of time, and they're basically all powerful. Like, that's the reason they were split apart by the gods in the first place, because the gods realized that once they got old enough to really harness their powers, they were going to be way too powerful to control. And the gods didn't want anything living that was more powerful than they were. So that's why they split the little girl into two. So when she figures herself out and puts herself back together, she literally just goes up to Nokov and touches him and makes him disappear, because she's just that bitch. So I thought that was funny, and it's like very similar to what he does in all his books. Like, from the brother of Shara's ex-boyfriend who gets just smashed in seconds, to the bad guy from the second book who gets smashed and just killed in seconds. Like, they all just die so easy in the end. And I don't really know what Bennett's trying to say about this, that all these plotters and schemers are so easy to dispatch in the end. It's just really funny, but it seems to be kind of his thing. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, that's the story. And then the other missing piece was Sigrid, and it's explained why he was able to stay so young all these years, because during his time before he met Shara, when he was like wandering the world really upset because he thought his family was dead, he was in jail at one point with a bunch of Continentals who gave them a really sick test in order to give them food. They were like, you can't eat anything unless you hold this divine object, which was a rock called the Finger of Kolkan. And it was a rock designed to get heavier and heavier the longer you hold it, until it's basically impossible to hold. And most people drop it after just a few seconds. Or maybe it gets hotter and hotter. I don't know. I think it was heavier, though, yeah. So anyway, most people just drop it. And the people at the prison said, you have to hold this for 1 minute or 30 seconds or whatever impossible time it was. Otherwise, you don't get any food. So Sigrid was the only one badass enough to hold it, because he felt like he deserved the punishment. And again, this god Kolkan was all about the punishment. So he holds on to this thing, and they keep their promise, and they feed him, and they tell him that he can share his food with the others if he wants, but he decides to be selfish, and they put him in his own cell, and he eats the food by himself. So he's still feeling haunted by that, because those guys all died like within days or hours of that incident, because they were so wretched and hungry in that jail. And ever since he did that, he's had this mark on his palm. Now, the mark was mentioned all the way back in book 1, but I didn't mention it in my video because it didn't seem that important. Like, he kept unwrapping his hand and looking at this mark, and it was like, okay, well, he's branded, he had this bad experience. But it turns out that this mark actually was the source of his strength and the source of his ability to kind of defy death, because he does all these crazy stunts and somehow lives, and his ability to take on the gods and godlike creatures. Like, at one point in this book, City of Miracles, he goes up against Nokov, and he manages to grab Nokov's hand when Nokov's trying to attack him. And Nokov is like, "Whoa, how did you do that?" And he starts crying like a little bitch. So that turns out to be pretty important, but it was well written enough and telegraphed way, way, way in advance enough that it didn't feel like, oh, suddenly this dude has divine powers. Like, there was plenty of evidence for it. It just wasn't explained. So the way that it gets explained is definitely very, like, exposition fairy-like, because Olvos, the goddess, makes a reappearance and is like, you are special because you are the only one who could withstand the punishment, and blah, blah, blah. So it is what it is. And then Olvos herself, shortly thereafter, winds up getting killed by her son Nokov, who takes her power and goes to do the thing, and then he gets killed by her daughter, the time goddess, Simpros. So everyone just does a thing and then gets killed. It's the way the story goes. So I'm just checking my notes here to see if there's anything else. In this book, it was also nice to get more of Sigrid's personal narrative, since he was the main character. We got to learn a bit more about his life and about Draeling's. We do find out that his other child is a daughter and has some kids But unfortunately, really not the best dad. He doesn't spend any time with her or his grandkids. Doesn't seem to GAF, so that's that. The end of the story signifies some really cool changes in the world. There used to be a giant wall around Bulletkoff that was super duper magical, because even though there was a wall, if you were on the inside, it did not look like there was a wall around the city, and it had a cool effect of like tapering off, so that when you kept looking up and up, you could see the stars and all this other stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to see, but you could kind of see them through the wall. So the whole wall just vanishes because the little girl, Simpros, decides she's going to use her newfound power of overtime to just kind of wipe out the whole world, because she's super upset that her mom is gone. Like the little pocket dimension version of Shada that she pulls out of the pocket dimension is killed, quote unquote, or like destroyed by Nokov. And witnessing this last remnant of her mother completely and finally die in a way that she now cannot bring her back at all, is what pushes her over the edge. It pushes Tatiana over the edge, and Tatiana remembers who she is, and then Tatiana reminds Malwina, and then they merge, and then they do the thing. So after she winks Nokov out of existence, in the denouement, it's really part of the climax still. Look at me pulling out my little English professor hat. Like, yes, right, sure, I'd say, do your story map. This is still the climax. Sigrid talks her down, like literally talks her down off the giant wall or whatever she was standing on, and convinces her not to end the world. They have a discussion about pain and regret and revenge, and it's kind of a continuation of the discussion they've been having as he was training her and teaching her how to use a gun, because his whole deal was like, well, I'm going to teach you this shit, but, it's not going to make you feel better. And because he kind of, he's been on this journey this whole time, and nothing he's done, like killing all those people, like made him feel better, didn't bring his daughter back. So he's able to really bond with her on that level, and he's the only one who could get through to her. And because of the mark on his hand and the divine power that it gave him, because the way Ovos described it, Kolkan's finger was never ever meant to be a test that a human being could pass. So when Sigurd passed the test, the little divine object, which we've already learned in the first book, can kind of think for themselves as independent things apart from the divinity that created them. So this divine object assumed he must be Kolkan, and it kind of merged with him, and that's how he got his power. So that was the exposition dump that we were given about that. So because he has that, he can defy the gods, which means that he can defy Nokov by grabbing his arm and making him whine like a bitch, and he can also get through to Simpros, even though she's in the middle of this like time vortex trying to destroy the world. So he does, and she agrees to not destroy everybody, and she disperses her own power. So she'll never be that powerful again, because she basically just gave all her power away. And at that point, she had not just her own significant power, but also Nokov's power, presumably, and all the little godlings that he ate. So she basically had all the godly power that there was left in the world. Because remember, Nokov ate Ovos, and Ovos was the last living god. So she dispersed it all around the world, and all the magic that was in that wall, she like sucked that up and dispersed it too. So at the end of the book, there are all these little miracles happening everywhere. And Robert Jackson Bennett has this way of just like skipping from scene to scene, like hundreds of miles away, like this cool thing is happening and this little thing is happening. And each one is like a little short story all in its own. And he does the same thing in American Elsewhere, but to much different effect. It's pretty horrific the way he does it in that book, actually. I won't spoil it, but oh my god. So anyway, this is much more positive and cheerful. And I really like this story device that he uses. It's really well done, really well written. So this is how he leaves things. Like, is this world ever going to be the same? Obviously not, because of all these little miracles happening everywhere. And he even starts to write about how society is restructuring itself. Now you have all these people whose miracle, like everyone has like one little magic trick that they can do. So everybody whose miracle or magic trick involves building things, like comes together to form their own guild of builders, and they're like monetizing this shit. So yeah, society's changing, and I love that too. I love how practical it is. Like, yeah, people are going to think magic is cool, but ultimately they're going to want to figure out a way to make money from it. Like, wouldn't you? So that just really speaks to me, and I love that. Anything I didn't love about it, basically, there was no table of contents, same stupid font for the title of the chapters. I mean, this is little itty-bitty stuff. I did like the fact that there was a sex scene. I don't want to make it seem like I'm obsessed with sex scenes, but I get really annoyed with fantasy books like this Brandon Sanderson idiot, like how they just dance around the sex scenes. I mean, people have sex. That's what people do. That's like people's main motivation in life half the time. They want to have sex with someone. So it doesn't make any sense to me that you'd write about human beings who have all this, all these other human qualities. Like, they want to fight, and they want to get revenge, and they want to get rich, and they're scheming, and they're dreaming, and they're doing all this stuff, but then they never fuck. They never even try. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So all of these sci-fi books, like, they're supposed to be for adults, right? Like, they're super violent and bloody, but usually there's no sex scene. So, or if there's something that's like, it could be a sex scene, but they chose to cut it there. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm sex obsessed, but that really frustrates me about science fiction and fantasy in general, and how just like prissy some of these authors are. It's frustrating. And they can write all of this amazing, fantastical, mind-bending, world-building stuff, but then they can't realistically write a love scene or even write two characters who legitimately seem to be physically attracted to each other. So I appreciated the fact that Robert Jackson Bennett is not one of those people, although this was really the first sex scene that he did, because Shara and her ex-boyfriend couldn't quite make it happen in the first book, but, he was gay. So, actually, there were a lot of sex scenes in that one, because he mentioned that when they first got together when they were in college, they basically slept together constantly. So he wasn't graphic about it, but it was there. So yeah, he's not like one of those other authors, and I appreciate that. Anything else? I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, thanks for listening. Good book, great series, and I cannot wait for the new Foundry side in April. I'm going to do my best to get these links out so that other people can hopefully actually join in on this discussion. And then I'll do another one of these for the first Foundry side book. And when the second Foundry side book finally comes out, I'll certainly do one for that sometime in April or May. And eventually I'll probably do one for American Elsewhere as well, but I really want to reread American Elsewhere before I do. So that's going to be a few months down the line, because I need time to let it simmer and then go back and reconsider it before I make my final decision. It is pretty good, but I just have some things I need to think about. So, thanks again, and see you in the pages.